Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing what's going to be my second to last of these catch-up wrap-ups that I've been doing for a number of months when life got in the way of me filming more difficult, in-depth videos like wrap-ups. And this one is for the month of January. Now in January I was planning on participating in a month-long readathon that was round 2 of Tome Infinity and Beyond. I'll link some info for that readathon down below. And that was a science fiction themed readathon that was very in-depth, lots of different layers of challenges to achieve various tiers, sort of building on the first round where you'd gone to different planets. This round you were building a space civilization. So I had been very excited about that. You got to buddy up for this round of Tome Infinity and Beyond, and I buddied up with Joe from Final Blow Joe, whose channel I will also link. And then January for me struck right away with a big family crisis that I was in the midst of for the entire month, and I could read very little. I tried to read some of the things on my TBR, and I did read 4 books that I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up, but I was reading through sort of a haze of more important life things going on, so I didn't have the level of detailed critical thought to apply to reading these books that I would normally try to bring to a wrap-up like this. So I think because January was such a rough month for me, this is going to be a fairly abbreviated wrap-up, at least by my standards. But the first thing I finished in the month was something I had been reading in December, and that was The Golden Compass by Phillip Pullman, the first book of his Dark Materials. This was a reread for me. I read these in high school, but I don't actually remember much of anything about them. I have a vague, foggy notion in my head of generally where the series is going. But this is a whole new experience for me rereading this series as an adult. When I read them in high school, it was a period of my reading life where I was just sort of consuming all of the books I could get my hands on, and I remember very little actual details of a lot of books I read during that time of my life. But I think because I did have some vague memories in my head of what this series is about, my reading experience for this first book, even if I remembered very little of the book itself, was really quite different than I think it would have been otherwise. Because a huge portion of this book reads like fairly straightforward middle grade fantasy adventure. There are mysterious people kidnapping children. The main character, Lyra, is sent away from the home she's always known, raised by scholars at Oxford in this alternate world. But she is rebellious and ends up going on her own adventure with a new group of people to rescue her kidnapped friend. There's also all of these hints that she is some sort of prophesied chosen one. And that all feels decently simple and formulaic, but this is also known for being a very sophisticated, dark, complicated theological series. And so this time around, knowing that I could sort of see where things were being dropped that were going to be part of that more sophisticated storyline. And so I wasn't as surprised by the turns that this book took towards the end. But I do think that sort of juxtaposition of that first large section of the book that feels very simplistic and childish with what else this series is gearing up to do makes this book a little hard to categorize. It is kind of hard for me to say, looking at this as an adult, what the target audience age range of this series should really be. Should it be an adult series, a YA series? The main character is more middle grade aged, but what middle grade readers would I recommend this to or not? I'm not really sure. That said, I definitely did enjoy it on this reread. I'm looking forward to continuing my reread of the series hopefully sometime soon. The world of this book is absolutely unusual and fascinating and doesn't get very thoroughly explained, at least in book one. It's definitely an alternate version of our world, but like pretty distantly alternate. There's a lot that is decidedly not the same and not just, with the introduction of all of the magical elements, including like the demons, which are like a part of a person's soul that manifests as an animal, or like the bears, which are people, but not in the same way that humans are, or the witches who show up towards the end of this book. There are a lot of things that are sort of referenced in terms of the larger world that aren't really explained. It's hard to even tell what like time period this is supposed to be based on, because there are some things that feel steampunkish about it. There are some things that feel more modern, but also some elements that feel sort of more socially regressive. And that was something that I don't think I even knew how to make like heads or tails of when I read this in like what, 9th grade, 10th grade. So that's something that I'm looking forward to seeing if there's more to discover about in the rest of the series that I missed on the first read when I was younger. I know that this gets into a sort of multiverse thing, and I'm curious about that because I think I will view that very, very differently than I did the first time I read this series. So, The Golden Compass, I mostly read it in December. I finished it up at the beginning of January and I gave it 4 stars. And then the rest of these books are going to be the ones that I was definitely reading like in a daze, and I wish I remembered more to like tell you about them, but I don't think I've got that much in me. The first thing was something else that I read before starting on the Tome Infinity books. Part of the thing for me is that like I felt very strongly that the only things I could really read for a lot of January would be like comfort reading, and for me most science fiction and definitely like most of the sci-fi that was on my Tome Infinity TBR is not that. When I need comfort reading, I gravitate towards middle grade and YA, I gravitate towards fantasy, and I definitely gravitate towards fairy tales. Also, graphic novels are something that are easier for me to read and consume at times when I find reading really hard. So I got a copy of Princess Ever After by Katie O'Neill from the library because I just felt like I wanted to give that to myself. And this was cute. It's available, I think, online as a webcomic. I think the print edition maybe has a little bit extra content in it, though. And this was Katie O'Neill's first graphic novel, I believe, and I've loved everything that she's published since. This, to me, wasn't as good as her later books, but it was still very sweet. This is about 2 princesses. It is a love story. One of them is trapped in a tower by her sister, who is the queen, and the other one comes to rescue her. And there are issues of like gender roles in fairy tales, which I think is based a bit on an oversimplified idea of what gender roles in fairy tales actually are to begin with. You know, the prince coming to rescue the princess from the tower is not what a whole lot of fairy tales actually are. But it's an idea that is very steeped into our cultural consciousness because of the types of adaptations of fairy tales that have been popular in decades prior to ours. And so this book is very much taking apart and dismantling some of those stereotypes. If I'm remembering correctly, it also deals with some like internalized fat phobia and mental health issues that the princess in the tower, Sadie, is dealing with. Katie O'Neill is good at bringing up a whole lot of different issues in the course of, over the course of a very short, sweet fantasy story. The thing that I didn't think was as good as her later books that I've read is the art. It's not as detailed, as sophisticated. It seems like a much more simplistic, underdeveloped art style than her more recent work. I absolutely love her art in the Tea Dragon Society and Aquacorn Cove, and this isn't quite at that level. I gave this 3 stars. It was cute. I was able to read it at a time when I was not able to read much, so hooray. And so next, the first of a whopping 2 books that I actually did manage to read for Tome Infinity and Beyond was A Hero for WondLa by Tony DiTerlizzi. This is the second book in a middle grade sci-fi series. I love that it's middle grade sci-fi. I wish we had more middle grade sci-fi. There is not much of it. It's also heavily illustrated and the art is just great. I was a fan of the first book. I continue to be a fan of this series. This book follows our protagonist, Ava 9, who has encountered at the end of the first book the other humans in her world whom she was looking for. She was raised by a robot in an underground sanctuary. She found an alien world when she emerged in book 1, and now she's found the other humans, and she feels like she's found the place where she's going to belong. That was like her dream and her quest in book 1. And then in this book she discovers that this human society, this human settlement is not quite everything that she could have hoped and dreamed that it would be, and that, you know, some of her alien friends that she made in book 1 are actually better and truer friends and family to her. This got darker than I was hoping that it would, specifically given the time that I read it. I was like, middle grade, I have a middle grade book on my TBR, it will be light and fluffy and fun. And it is fun, it is an adventure, but it's not necessarily light in terms of the themes. I was genuinely surprised with how like dark and dystopian some of this got for a middle grade novel. I remember seeing when I was reading the first book really quite a long time ago. I should have continued on with this series sooner because there were a lot of details about different characters and things that I'd forgotten, but that's a different issue. But I remember seeing when I read the first book that the author was inspired to an extent by like The Wizard of Oz in terms of how he was writing this series, and there was like a very, very explicit Wizard of Oz reference in the first book, but aside from that I didn't feel like the comparison was actually particularly apt. In this one, though, I can sort of see like an Emerald City influence in the human city of New Attica that Ava gets to, so maybe the sort of Wizard of Oz influence will be more visible if you read the series as a whole than just the first book. There's this element of like brainwashing the population of the city and the fact that the leader is not what he seems to be. I think that Oz influence also comes through a little bit in the art with some of the very like whimsical fashion makeover design stuff that happens. There's also an interesting new character who's introduced who is essentially Ava's sister, Ava 8, the previous girl raised in her sanctuary, and that relationship is fraught because they are each so happy to have found the other, but they have very, very different ideas of what the right thing to do is, and so they end up clashing over some really big stuff. And come the end of this book, we've basically got this scenario where it's a middle grade science fiction adventure where the humans seem to be the bad guys, and I am kind of into that. I want to read book 3 now more promptly than I got around to reading book 2 because I don't want to forget all of the things about this book that I forgot about the first book before continuing on. Also, I gave this 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave book 1, like a couple years ago now. And then the last book I read was God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach by Kelly Robson, which is a Tor.com novella. This one, by the way, is also nominated for a Hugo Award in the novella category this year. And this is a complicated enough book that of all the books in this wrap-up, I think I'm going to feel most keenly my inability to talk about it as deeply as it deserves. But this is a time travel book that involves a system of time travel that has been the understanding of exactly how it works has been very tightly guarded by the company that invented it. Their claim is that basically you can't change the past this way because it creates like a whole separate alternate timeline, but then that alternate timeline will disappear when the time travelers come back out of it. But they're not transparent about any of their research at all, so you sort of just have to trust them when they say that alternate timeline will collapse when you leave. And one of the issues that is very central to this premise then is what are the ethical implications of doing things in that timeline that may harm the people who are living in that place and time that you travel to. Can you just brush that all away because none of it really counts? Or does it? This is about a woman named Min who puts together a team to win a job that involves time travel, going back to ancient Mesopotamia to do an ecological study of the rivers. There's a lot of business and economics in the framing of this story, about how the invention of time travel made time travel projects look like such a much flashier, better investment of money than putting those efforts into things that will actually rehabilitate and restore the livability of Earth as it is now. And there's a whole lot that goes into that world building of Earth as it is now, where people like Min have tried to dedicate their lives to restoration of parts of the sort of ecologically decimated planet. And then there's also a generational conflict between her generation that lived through incredible strife and trials, and the younger generation who have not, but should be at the forefront of this new world that is ostensibly being made for them, right? And that's just like the little bits of it that I vaguely remember feeling were important. There's a lot that I'm just not remembering that I didn't totally internalize. And so the main storyline of the novella involves all of this prep leading up to the mission itself, and then it includes the mission itself. And then you get interspersed throughout these little snippets of what's happening in the place that they're going to in ancient Mesopotamia, and what's happening with like the people there as they start to see signs of this incredibly high-tech, beyond their comprehension sort of invasion on their river. And that storyline, you start to get it at the very beginning of the novella, even though the actual main storyline doesn't get to that point until like halfway through. So you start to see some of the things that are happening in the main storyline and how they fit back to these little snapshots that you've been getting all along, until at the end it all catches up with itself, if that makes any sense. And the ending of this book is very ambiguous. I gave this book 4 stars. It didn't leave me feeling particularly good. Part of me emotionally, given where I was in my life at that point, wanted a clear-cut ending, and this decidedly doesn't do that. But I can't fault it for that, because what it does is very interesting and thought-provoking, and I think if I had been in a more normal frame of mind for me, I would have liked it a good deal more. So those were the books that I read in January. For Tome Infinity and Beyond, you were trying to hit a whole ton of challenges to build up the tiers of your civilization. And you could double things for different challenges, and also if you were working with a buddy like I was, you and your buddy were working together to hit all those different challenges. So I have Joe to thank for the fact that we actually did incredibly well at Tome Infinity and Beyond, despite the fact that I failed miserably at all of my TBR. We were initially planning on going all the way to Galactic Empire. We did not make it all the way to Galactic Empire. I think we made it to, like, the tier 1 below that, which is something like Thriving Civilization. I forget what it was actually called, but we did good. I did count one more thing that I read in the month for a number of challenges, and that was a short story, and I know that was fudging it a bit, but the story was When Robot and Crow Saved East St. Louis by Annalee Newitz. You can read it online. I'm going to link it below. It did have a lot of big themes in it that ticked off quite a few of the challenges. I think I counted it for like 3 or 4 different challenges, that one short story. But that story, I think, shares a number of themes and big idea issues with Newitz's novel Autonomous, so if you liked Autonomous, you might want to check out that story as well. And that is all that's going to be my catch-up wrap-up for January. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you're planning to. Let me know if you participated in Tome Infinity and Beyond, and if so, how that went for you. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.